and welcome to our second tutorial in the series on garment basics. In this lesson, we will continue to look at some of the basic elements of drawing garments and drapery. In the previous tutorial, we looked at the basic drop fold and how it can be built into more complex forms. In this lesson, we're going to look at hanging folds that are suspended from 2 points. Firstly, the folds are formed along a common axis, which can be straight or curved. Here we have a straight axis and our folds. Here we have a curved axis The axis can also be facing this way. Note that at the top of the fold, it's shallower, and as we get further down, each fold gets deeper. Also, it's important to note that these lines are not parallel. We don't draw them like this. The forms show the weight of gravity on the one hand and the resistance of the fabric hanging from the suspension points on the other. The folds formed by the fabric can be shallow or deep depending on the length of the fabric and the distance between the suspension points. So if we have a long piece of fabric, it will more likely look like this. A very shallow piece of fabric will look like this. Practice drawing folds like this to get a sense of the folds and their movement. But remember that in Byzantine iconography, we break up our lines. So the next step is to break these lines to create the sense of rhythm and flow. It's important to start by practicing the simplest forms of these folds before trying to make them more complex, because there's a danger of losing the rhythm. So we can break up the lines like this. Usually, unless a line is a contour line, it's going to be broken in some way. Here we will leave the bottom line as a contour line. When the folds are long and narrow, they won't be broken up to quite the same degree. They might have just 1 or 2 breaks. Now that we've got a bit of a feel for these folds, we can see how they're used in practice. One of the simplest forms where we see these folds is a table or a bed cover. A good example of this would be the funeral bier of the Theotokos, which can come something like this. It can be easiest to start with the deepest fold and then work our way to the shallower folds. And here we're going to have a deeper fold still. We can also often see these folds in the decorative cloth painted on the lower walls of churches, which usually looks something like this. These kinds of folds are also often used for the cloth of the Holy Mandilion. Here we'll have a drop fold on the ends. Of course, the face of Christ will be superimposed on the cloth, but we need to always keep in mind that the folds need to fall logically behind the face of Christ. And these folds can also be seen on the cloth that hangs between buildings, indicating that an event is occurring indoors. Now let us see how these folds are applied to garments. We will commonly see them on the tunic, and they can vary from very simple to quite complex. Keep in mind that because of the dynamic nature of the pose, the axis is off-center, so the folds must follow the axis. So if we have our axis over here, here's the wider side, the narrower side, the arms will be coming over here. Now normally we'll have the arms coming in front and it might be covered, but we want to see how the fabric falls normally. And we've always got to keep that in mind, even though it may be covered by something else. We don't just draw random lines all over the place. So if our waist comes about here, if we say this might be a noble saint and has this decorative band around the neck, it's easiest often, as I said, to start with the deepest fold. I'm just keeping these folds very simple to give the idea of how they work. We'll look at some icons where they're far more complex. And also when we see in examples and when we start working in color, the highlights will also follow the same fold pattern in the lightest areas, but we don't draw those into the sketch. Again, we see these folds in the Maphorian or in the Hierarch's vestments. And I start off with an axis line. Well, say the top, the neck is coming over here. Arms will be coming roughly over here. Here I will roughly draw in the arms because the material falls over the arms. And it's important when drawing vestments to always be aware that we're not just drawing random lines. There has to be a logic behind what we're drawing. When we're drawing a hierarch's vestments, even though part of the Philonion might be covered by the Omophorion, which is over here, we still have to be aware of how the fabric is falling beneath that garment. It still needs to have logic and rhythm. So practice drawing these types of vestments on their own before adding the Omophorion on top. So, as you said, the fabric will usually fall over the arms in some way. And then we'll fall down like this. Usually the hands might be over here in a blessing and holding a gospel book. but always be aware of how the fabric is falling below those things. Another example of clothing where we can see these kind of folds is on the cloak or mandia hanging from the shoulder and the hand. So if we have figure coming like this, axis line over here. Have the mandia coming like this. You might have a hand raised over here. And the cloak falling like this. And of course we often see these folds in sleeves or fabric hanging over arms. So if we have our basic sleeve, the highlights again, as we've said, will also follow the movements of the folds, but we don't draw that into the sketch. And of course we can have the longer sleeve or cloak that's hanging off the arm. And again, the highlights will be also following that movement. So now that we've drawn some simple hanging folds, let's have a look at the works of the masters to see how they implement these kinds of folds. Here we have an example of the funeral bier of the Theotokos, and it's quite clear the simple hanging folds and how they're also created by the highlights over here. And here is another example of a bed where, again, if we zoom in, we can also see how the highlights form the hanging folds. Here we have a holy altar table, which although it's damaged in the front, over here we can clearly see the use of hanging folds. And here we have a decorative wall hanging on the low part of the church wall. And here is the ornamental cloth hanging on the buildings It indicates that an event is taking place indoors. We can also clearly see the hanging folds in the cloth wrapped around Christ's waist. As well as in the loincloth he wears in the crucifixion icon. Here we have an icon of St. Kyrikos wearing a typical tunic, and we can clearly see the simple use of the hanging folds over here. Again, here we have a tunic, and you can see that the folds are becoming slightly more complex. Here we can see the use of the hanging folds not only in the tunic, but also the material falling from the waist, and also the material falling from the knee. Here we have another similar example where we can see the folds on the tunic, also on the straight leg, the material falling here, and again the material falling below the knee. We can also see it on the cloak, the mandia, in the background over here. In this icon of Saint Fontigny, again we can see it on the tunic, the top, the fabric falling from her waist and from the knee. In this icon, we can clearly see the hanging folds on the cloak, and again falling from the knee. And here we have an example of the cloak suspended from the shoulder and from the hand, falling and forming this pattern. And again here we can see that pattern on the bishop's vestments. Here again we can see it on the tunic, and also on the cloak or mandia that he's holding, that's suspended from this point and from his hand. And again clearly here you can see the transverse patterns formed by this. Here we have another very good example of priestly vestments, and you can clearly see the V pattern formed by the material forming. And we can also see the pattern formed by the cloth hanging from his arm. In this icon we can see the pattern developed both on the top of the tunic here and over here. Here we have a very similar example, but here you can clearly see there's an axis moving in this direction, and that the folds are following that axis and not coming straight down. Here we have another example of where we might see this hanging fold pattern in the cloth hanging from the arm. Finally, here we can see again the pattern formed by the cloth falling from the waist, but it's following the movement of the body and the axis in this direction. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. Until next time, keep drawing.